Discussing the next continuation of the previous topic, that is the anatomy of brain. And you must remember your previous class that we discussed the anatomy of skull, and in that class I told you that how the brain is located within the skull. I told you that this is the cranial fossa and this is occupied by the brain, right? But today we will be dealing in detail the anatomy of brain, right? So shall we continue?
Yes.
All right. So starting with the anatomy of brain. So you see that the brain is the most integral part of the human body, and it is the important part of the nervous system. And you know that the nervous system is having two parts. One is central nervous system and another is peripheral nervous system. And the brain is the most important part of the central nervous system, right? So now we'll be coming to the parts of brain. If you talk about the parts of brain, the brain is having three parts, that is forebrain, midbrain and hindbrain. And the forebrain consists of the cerebrum. So this is the picture where you can see the image of a brain, of the intact brain, and this part is the forebrain, right? And the second part which I discussed was the midbrain, which is hidden within the forebrain, and the third part is the hindbrain. But now initially we'll be dealing with the forebrain, which mainly includes the cerebrum. If you have a look at the second diagram, this is the sagittal section of the cranial cavity, and you can see here all the parts of brain, which are cerebrum, that is the forebrain, followed by midbrain, and the third part I just now told, that is the hindbrain. This whole is the hindbrain, and we'll be dealing with all the parts of brain one by one, starting with the cerebrum first of all.
So midbrain is in the middle?
Yes, the midbrain is basically, it is lying just deep to the cerebrum. Here you can see this small part is the midbrain, the small part, and normally in an intact brain we can't see it. If you will be doing a sagittal section of the brain, only then you can appreciate the midbrain. Okay. So now, before moving to the parts of brain in detail, you should be well aware of its orientation in the cranial cavity and about the coverings of brain. So this diagram is showing you the brain located in the cranial cavity. This is how the brain is located in the cranial cavity, and it is tightly packed. But there are a set of three coverings which cover the brain, and they are basically the protective coverings. And anatomically we call them meninges. So the three coverings or the three meninges of the brain are, from the outer aspect to the inner aspect, they are named as the dura mater. The middle layer is called arachnoid mater, and the innermost layer is called the pia mater. So this diagram is the enlarged view of the upper diagram, and you can see all the coverings of the brain, the dura mater, then we have arachnoid mater, and the innermost is the pia mater. Another thing which you can see here is the presence of a large space called subarachnoid space. Now this subarachnoid space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and this fluid, it basically it provides a cushioning effect to the brain. So if you can see, this is the brain, the vault of the skull has been removed from one side of the skull, and the brain would be covered by three coverings named as dura mater, arachnoid mater and pia mater. And the space which I'm talking about is the subarachnoid space. It is deep to the second layer, that is the arachnoid mater, and the name of the space is subarachnoid space. Remember, subarachnoid space, the name itself is suggesting sub means below, arachnoid, the space below the arachnoid mater, and this is your subarachnoid space, and it is a large space filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. So what is the basic function of the fluid present in this subarachnoid space? Basically this fluid, it acts as a shock absorbing medium. So if there is any excessive movement of the skull, as if in an accident or in some other trauma, any direct impact on the brain is being prevented by the cushioning effect of the fluid present in the subarachnoid space. Basically, it absorbs that shock and prevents the damage to the delicate brain tissue, right? So in brief, I'm summarizing that the three coverings of the brain named as meninges, they are basically giving a protective effect to the brain. They provide a protective function along with the cerebrospinal fluid, all right? So the nature has given a good mechanism for the protection of our most integral organ of the body, that is in the form of meninges and cerebrospinal fluid, all right? So now we'll be moving in detail to the anatomy of brain. So I hope you all are clear with the meninges and the subarachnoid space by now? Yeah. Okay. So now coming to the largest part of the brain, that is cerebrum. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain and it is located in the cranial cavity. So you can see this is the cranial cavity, and again this is the brain located in the cranial cavity. So you can see this hole is the cerebrum, all right? So the cerebrum is basically lying in relation to interior cranial fossa. You remember the cranial fossa we talked about last time? So this is the interior cranial fossa, this is the middle cranial fossa, and this one is the posterior cranial fossa. So the interior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and upper part of posterior cranial fossa is occupied by cerebrum. Keep one thing in mind, I have said the upper part of posterior cranial fossa, not the lower part, all right? So these are this is the area which is occupied by the cerebrum. So all of you are clear with the positioning of the cerebrum in the cranial cavity?
So
Okay.
meninges covers the entire cerebrum?
It covers the entire brain.
Okay.
Brain, that is cerebrum, midbrain, and then again the hindbrain. And again another thing is it continues down, covering the outer aspect of spinal cord as well. So basically we can say that it provides a protective covering to the entire central nervous system, that is the brain and the spinal cord.
Okay.
So again you must have heard about the lumbar puncture. What is that? Basically the collection of cerebrospinal fluid in the region of lumbar spine. So how is that possible? It's possible only because we have cerebrospinal fluid in the region of the vertebral column. Okay. So now coming back to the cerebrum, so just now I told you, again you can see that cerebrum was the largest part of the brain. This picture is showing you. So this hole is the cerebrum and it is the largest part of the brain. And again you can see that the cerebrum is having the two parts. So this is basically the superior view of cerebrum. The cerebrum is seen from the superior aspect like this. And you can see that it is having two hemispheres, the right and left cerebral hemispheres, and they are separated from each other by a fissure. We call it as medial longitudinal fissure. So the medial longitudinal fissure separates the right cerebral hemisphere from the left cerebral hemisphere. Basically it's present in the form of a cleft. And in this model again you can see this is the right cerebral hemisphere and this is the fissure which is separating the right cerebral hemisphere from the left cerebral hemisphere. So the medial longitudinal fissure, also called longitudinal cerebral fissure, it separates the right and left cerebral hemispheres. Besides this medial longitudinal fissure, it also contains the indentations of the coverings of the brain. That is the dura mater, arachnoid mater and pia mater also runs in this fissure. It will run in this medial longitudinal fissure. So if we talk about the architecture or the arrangement of cells in the cerebral cortex, so this is the picture we get. So what is this picture depicting? This is the coronal section of the brain, and here you can see the arrangement of structures within the core of cerebrum. So this is one cerebral hemisphere, and you can see the composition of the cerebral hemisphere is such that it is composed of the outer layer of the gray matter. So this is the outer gray matter depicted in dark pink color, and the inner, this one is the white matter. So what is basically the gray matter and white matter? So in your basic anatomy classes, I told you that the gray matter is basically the place where all the cell bodies of the neurons, they get aggregated, they are lying. Whereas the white matter is that part of the nervous system where we have the axons. So that is the basic difference between the gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is the area where we have the cell bodies of the neuron. You know that the neuron is having two parts, that is the cell body and the axon. The cell body is also called, what is the other name of cell body? That is the cyton, right? So the cell bodies are basically located in the gray matter, whereas axons are located in the white matter. So the arrangement of cells in the cerebrum is, it is having an outer layer of cerebral cortex and an inner mass of white matter. We call it as gray matter and white matter respectively. Is it clear? Besides that, this white matter also contains some nuclei, which is again the aggregation of the cell bodies. And these nuclei, they are named as thalamus, lentiform nucleus and putamen. These are the main nuclei present within the white matter of cerebrum. And the next thing, which is an important part of the cerebrum, is the cavity called ventricle. So in this specimen you can see that there is a cavity within the core of cerebrum. This cavity is called ventricle. We call it as lateral ventricle, and it is filled with the cerebrospinal fluid, which is being produced by the brain, and it comes outside through various apertures, and it is covering the outer aspect of the brain, that is in the form of CSF. So the CSF is basically produced within the cavities of the brain, that is the ventricle. It leaves the cavity of the brain and it covers the exterior of the brain. So this is the basic arrangement of the structures within the cerebrum, right? I'm repeating it. It is having an outer layer of gray matter, inner white matter with masses of nuclei embedded in the white matter, and a cavity, we call it as the lateral ventricle. So another important thing to know is that I told you that the cerebrum is having two hemispheres, that is right and left hemispheres. So it is not that the two hemispheres, they are totally apart from each other, or they are not in connectivity with each other. There is a very unique and distinct source of communication between the two hemispheres, so that the exchange of information can take place between the two hemispheres, and that connection is present in the form of corpus callosum. So what is corpus callosum? Basically it is a band of commissural fibers. They are basically the band of fibers which run from one cerebral hemisphere to the other cerebral hemisphere for the exchange of information between the two hemispheres. And this is the section of the corpus callosum running from one cerebral hemisphere to the other cerebral hemisphere. So I hope the general introduction of cerebrum is clear to you all by now. Okay. So now moving on to the surface features or external features of the cerebrum, that how many parts a cerebrum is having, how many borders or poles and surfaces. So in external features we will be basically dealing with the borders of cerebrum, then we will be dealing with its poles. So now starting with the poles of cerebrum. So the cerebrum is having three poles, and they're named as the frontal pole, occipital pole and the temporal pole. The name itself is suggesting the position of these poles in the cranial cavity. So you can see that the frontal pole is directed towards the front or interiorly, and it is in relation to the frontal bone. So you know that this is the frontal bone, and the frontal pole is lying just on the inner aspect of the frontal bone, right? So this frontal pole is lying in relation to the frontal bone of the skull. Another pole that is lying just opposite to the frontal pole, that is the occipital pole. Again, its name is suggesting its position in the cranial cavity. So you know that there is another bone in the skull, that is the occipital bone, and this is the occiput or the occipital bone, and this is the position of the occipital pole in the skull, right? So now you know that the frontal pole is directed interiorly or towards the front, and this is the occipital pole that is directed posteriorly in relation to the occipital pole. And there is the third pole, we call it as temporal pole, which is lying just below and behind the frontal pole, and this pole is lying in relation to the temporal bone. You know, this is the temporal bone of the skull, and this is the middle cranial fossa, and this is the position of the temporal pole of cerebrum in the cranial cavity. All right, so by now you should be able to memorize the three poles of the cerebrum, which are named as the anterior one, that is the frontal pole, the posterior one, that is the occipital pole, and the one below and behind the frontal pole, that is the temporal pole. All the three lying in relation to the frontal bone, occipital bone, and the temporal bone respectively. Right. So the next thing we'll be dealing is the surfaces of the cerebrum. And this picture is again showing you all the three surfaces of the cerebrum, and they are named as, the first is the superolateral surface, the second surface is the medial surface, whereas the third surface is inferior surface. Again, their name is suggesting their positioning in the cranial cavity. So what does the superolateral surface depict? This thing depicts that the surface of the cerebrum, which is directed bit superiorly and laterally, right? So this is the superolateral surface of the cerebrum. Is it clear? Now talking about the second surface of the cerebrum, that is the medial surface. So this is the medial surface, which is flat, and it is in contact with the medial surface of the opposite cerebral hemisphere. Again, I'm disarticulating the cerebrum here, and this surface is the medial surface, which is lying in proximity to the medial surface of the opposite cerebral hemisphere. Is it clear? So which surface is this? This is the superolateral surface, and the other one, this is the medial surface. And the third surface is the inferior surface, which is directed inferiorly. Inferior means directed below or facing towards the inferior aspect. So the three surfaces of the cerebrum are the superolateral surface, the medial surface, and the inferior surface, which is directed below. So what are these diagrams depicting? Again, they are showing all the three surfaces. This whole is the superolateral surface, which is a convex surface directed upwards and laterally, and it lies in relation to the cranial vault. This is the cranial vault, and the vault is basically in relation to this, to the superolateral surface. The superolateral surface is lying in proximity to the vault of the skull. Okay. The second surface, this is the medial surface, this hole, right? And it is lying in the midline. It is lying in the middle of the body, in the sagittal plane. Whereas the third one is the inferior surface directed below, and it is lying in relation to the cranial fossae or the fossae of the skull, that is anterior and middle cranial fossa, and also in relation to the posterior cranial fossa. So this surface would be it will be having in contact with the inferior surface of the cerebrum. So after discussing the poles and the surfaces of the cerebrum, we'll be moving on to the next thing, that is the borders. So again, like the three surfaces and three poles, the cerebrum is having three borders. It's all in three. Three poles, three surfaces, three borders. And the three borders of the cerebrum are superomedial border, number one. The second one is the inferolateral border, number two. And the third one is the inferomedial or medial border. So again I'm disarticulating the cerebrum, and this one is the superomedial border, which is basically the demarcation between the superolateral surface and the medial surface. So the border between the superolateral surface and the medial surface is given the name superomedial border. Whereas the second border, that is the inferolateral border, is this one, which is directed inferiorly and laterally. This is the inferolateral border of the cerebrum. And the third border is the inferomedial border, which is directed inferiorly and medially. The same thing would be shown in this diagram. So this is the superomedial border, this one. This is the superomedial border, and it is separating the superolateral surface from the medial surface. And in this specimen, this is the superomedial border, which is having superolateral surface on the other end, and this is the medial surface. Whereas again this is the superomedial border with the superolateral surface and the medial surface on the other end. And in the specimen, this is the superomedial border, separating the superolateral surface from the medial surface. So now the second border is the inferolateral border, this hole, starting from the frontal pole, running down, continuing with the temporal pole, again running back and ending at the occipital pole. This is the extent of inferolateral border. In contrast, if we talk about the extent of superomedial border, it again started from the frontal pole, extended upwards, backwards and then downwards, and ended at the occipital pole. So now you can see the difference between the superomedial border and the inferolateral border. The third border I was talking about is the inferomedial border. This is the inferomedial border, which is separating the medial surface from the inferior surface. Again, this border is starting at the frontal pole, running backwards, passing across the nuclei present within the core of cerebrum, running back and ending at the occipital pole, but it is demarcating which two surfaces? The medial surface is separated from the inferior surface via this inferomedial border. Again, this is your inferomedial border, which is starting from the frontal pole, running directly back, vertically back, again enclosing or making an indentation and enclosing the midbrain, again running back and ending at the occipital pole. So this is the inferomedial border, whereas this is your inferolateral border. So these are the three borders of the cerebrum. I'm repeating, the three borders of the cerebrum, they are named as superomedial border, inferolateral border and inferomedial border. So summarizing the surface features, the cerebrum is having three poles, three surfaces and three borders. So are all these three things clear to you? The poles, surfaces and borders? If it's clear, then I'll be moving on to the next part of the cerebrum. So the next thing which we'll be discussing in the cerebrum is the demarcation of the cerebrum into lobes. What are basically lobes? Lobes are the parts of the cerebrum. So how the cerebrum is divided into different lobes, we'll be discussing it now. So this is the schematic diagram of the side view of the cerebrum, and you can see that the different areas of the cerebrum has been given different color coding. Why? To differentiate between the different lobes of the cerebrum. So before moving on to the lobes of cerebrum, you should be familiar with the term sulci and gyri. What does the word sulci and gyri means? So the gyrus is basically an elevation, whereas the sulcus is the depression. So in certain areas, the cells of the cerebrum, they are present in the form of a surface elevation, which is a gyrus, and again it dips down and it forms a sulcus. Again there is a surface elevation and a depression. So this is the gyrus, which is the surface elevation, whereas this cleft is called sulcus. Gyrus is basically an elevation. What do we call it? Gyrus. And the plural for gyrus is gyri. Gyri. And the second is, that is the cleft or an indentation. It is called sulcus. And its plural is sulci. So the surface of the brain is thrown into a number of surface elevations and depressions, which is given the name gyrus and sulcus. Its plural is gyri and sulci. The same thing you can see in this picture now. You can see there are number of surface elevations as well as depressions on the surface of the cerebrum. What are they? They are basically the gyrus. These whole are the gyri, whereas these clefts which are present in between the gyri, they are called sulci. So what is the basic purpose of formation of these sulci and gyri? So what happens is, in the later stages of the embryonic life, that is after about 7 months of fetal life, the neurons, as they get aggregating within the brain, to accommodate the more number of neurons, the brain is having a tendency to get folded upon itself. The cerebrum is having a capacity to fold upon itself so as to accommodate more number of neurons within the cranial cavity. And because of that, we have the formation of the sulci and gyri. Alright, so the basic thing you should know is, the brain is accommodating more number of neurons if it is having a capacity to form gyrus and sulci, right? And it will be performing its function in a more effective way as compared to the animals which are less evolved, if we talk about the non-primates or the other animals which are not humans. Why humans are more evolved? Why human brain is more evolved? Because it has more higher integral functions of the brain, and it is having a capacity to accommodate more number of neurons in the form of sulci and gyri. So the cerebral cortex or the sulci and gyri, they are more extensive in humans.
So person is brainy depending on the
Yeah. That also is an important factor. Yeah. So I just now told you that there are infinite sulci and gyri. There are many in number, but the more prominent is the central sulcus. So this is one of the important sulcus of the cerebrum. We call it as central sulcus, this one. And I'll be drawing the schematic diagram of the cerebrum again here for a better understanding. So this is the superolateral surface of the cerebrum, and the first sulcus which I am discussing is the central sulcus. Again, the name itself is suggesting the sulcus present in the central part of the cerebrum. The central sulcus, it runs downwards and forwards. It starts from the superomedial border, just behind the midpoint of the superomedial border. So this is the middle point. Just behind the middle point, there starts the central sulcus. It runs downwards and forwards in this manner. This sulcus is named central sulcus. You can see here, this one is the central sulcus. The second sulcus which we will be discussing is the lateral circus. This sulcus, it starts from the temporal pole, runs backwards and upwards in this manner. So basically this central sulcus, it cuts the lateral sulcus in this way. This one is the central sulcus, whereas another sulcus running backwards and then upwards from the frontal pole, this one is named as lateral sulcus. So the two sulci are clear, the central sulcus and the lateral sulcus.
Yeah.
This is the picture of the lateral sulcus. The third sulcus is the parieto-occipital sulcus, which is basically present in the form of a small indentation, whose major part is present on the medial surface, but on the superolateral surface only a small part of parieto-occipital sulcus is seen. But we draw an imaginary line running downwards and forwards from the parieto-occipital sulcus. This is parieto-occipital sulcus. So an imaginary line running downwards and forwards from parieto-occipital sulcus, and another imaginary line running backwards from the lateral sulcus. It leads to the formation of 4 lobes of cerebrum, and they are named as frontal lobe, which is that lobe of cerebrum which is lying in front of central sulcus and above lateral sulcus. Is it clear? The lobe lying in front of central sulcus and above the lateral sulcus is named as frontal lobe. The second lobe is the parietal lobe, which is lying behind the central sulcus, in front of parieto-occipital sulcus and above the lateral sulcus. This lobe is parietal lobe. The third lobe is temporal lobe. And where it is located? It is located below the lateral sulcus, or we can say in between the lateral sulcus and which border of the cerebrum? Inferior lateral border. And the fourth lobe, or the last lobe of the cerebrum, is the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe, which is lying behind the parieto-occipital sulcus. So this is how, via the sulci, the various sulci and some imaginary lines, we demarcate the cerebrum, we divide the cerebral hemisphere into 4 lobes named as frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe and occipital lobe. And again, these lobes are related to the corresponding bones of the skull. That is, most of the part of the frontal lobe would be related to the frontal bone. This is the frontal bone, whereas the parietal lobe will be in relation to the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe will be in relation to the occipital bone, whereas the temporal lobe will be lying in relation to the temporal bone. So you can correlate that how the bones of the skull, they are collaborating with the lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. So again, this is the color demarcation for the various lobes. This is the frontal lobe lying in front of the central sulcus, depicted in pink color, whereas this green color depicts the parietal lobe, and it is lying behind the central sulcus, above lateral sulcus and in front of parieto-occipital sulcus. The next is the occipital lobe, shown in yellow color, and it is lying behind the parieto-occipital sulcus. And the fourth one is your lateral sulcus, temporal lobe lying below the lateral sulcus. And the same demarcation is shown on the medial surface. So on the medial surface, this is your frontal lobe, then we have parietal lobe, occipital lobe and the temporal lobe, right? So by now you are familiar with the three main sulci of cerebrum, that is the central sulcus, the lateral circus, and the parieto-occipital sulcus, which has demarcated the cerebrum into 4 lobes. But besides this, there are other sulci and gyres as well, and it is very important to know about those sulci and gyres as well, because each sulci and gyre is having its own functional importance. It is having its own function to perform. So now we will be discussing other sulci and gyres of the cerebrum, right? So we will be discussing these sulci and gyres according to the lobes. So first we will be discussing the sulci and gyres of the frontal lobe, then of the parietal lobe, then we will move on to the occipital lobe, and then afterwards we will be doing the sulci and gyres of the temporal lobe. So now starting with the sulci and gyri of the frontal lobe. So this picture, the whole green color is basically showing you all the sulci and gyres of the frontal lobe. And I think by now you are in a position to identify this sulcus. So this is the central sulcus, alright, which is separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So there is another sulcus which is running in front and parallel to the central sulcus. We call it as precentral sulcus. What is this? This is the precentral sulcus. The same sulcus is shown in this diagram. This is the precentral sulcus. Is it clear? This one. In front of the precentral sulcus, you will come across two another sulci which are running horizontally and forwards towards the frontal pole, and they're named as superior frontal sulcus and inferior frontal sulcus. So this one is the superior frontal sulcus, whereas this one is the inferior frontal sulcus. Again, in this diagram, in this picture, this is the area of the superior frontal sulcus, and this is the inferior frontal sulcus. So there are 3 main sulci in the frontal lobe named precentral sulcus, superior frontal sulcus, and inferior frontal sulcus. And because of these sulci, we have certain gyri formation in the frontal lobe, and those gyri are the precentral gyrus, this one. This is the precentral gyrus, and in this picture, this is the precentral gyrus. And another gyrus which is lying above the superior frontal sulcus, this one is superior frontal gyrus. Another gyrus between superior and inferior frontal sulcus, this is the middle frontal gyrus. And the third one, this is the inferior frontal gyrus. I'll be drawing all these sulci and gyri in this picture as well. This is the central sulcus, a sulcus running downwards and parallel to the central sulcus. This is the precentral sulcus. And another sulcus which is running horizontally and forwards, this is the superior and inferior frontal sulcus, leading to the formation of precentral gyrus, superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. So these are the main sulci and gyri of the frontal lobe. And what is the main function of the precentral gyrus? This is very important. This you should know in the frontal lobe, that this precentral gyrus, the name is precentral gyrus. This area is basically the primary motor area of the brain. Now what does the word primary motor area means? It is basically having the neurons which are basically controlling the musculature of a body. It is controlling the voluntary activity of all the muscles of the body. So example is, if you are able to move your arms, your limbs, if you are able to move your body, that is only because the neurons present in the precentral gyrus. And because of this function, this gyrus is named as primary motor area. What do we name as? What do we name it? Primary motor area. So the primary motor area of the cerebrum is basically located in the precentral gyrus, and it is having the neurons which is controlling all the voluntary muscles of the body. And what is the applied aspect of this thing? So if there is any head injury or damage or rupturing of the artery supplying this gyrus, what will happen? These neurons, they will stop functioning, ultimately leading to the paralysis of the body. And in that condition, a person will not be able to move his body. He will not be able to do any voluntary movement if there is any damage to the precentral gyrus or the primary motor area of the cerebrum, right? Okay. So with this, we have finished with the sulci and gyri of the frontal lobe, as well as the functional importance of the precentral gyrus, which is also called the primary motor area of the cerebrum. So the lobes, the sulci and gyri, and the functional areas of the other lobes of the cerebrum will be dealing in the next class. And your assignment for today is that you are going to draw the diagram for the superolateral surface of the cerebrum, showing its demarcation into various lobes along with the sulci. So this is what you are going to do for today, and you're going to read all the text through the Gray's Anatomy and make the suitable diagrams related to that. And if you have any doubt regarding today's topic, we can discuss it tomorrow, right? Have a good day.